Hey, it's Rick, aka Concrete River. Have another single profile test. A whole bunch of flavors. Going to go over mandarins and tangerines today. So again, the idea here isn't necessarily cover every single mandarin or tangerine on the market. Just go over some of the ones that I've used. List some strengths, list some weaknesses. Kind of make a recommendation if you're only going to be picking up one or two flavors out of the entire genre. Um, So, for testing today, I have Capella Sweet Tangerine. I have Medicine Flower Mandarin. I also have Flavourart Blood Orange, Flavourart Mandarin, Flavorwest Tangerine, and sure there's one more in there. I don't know. We'll burn that bridge when we get there. So 6 flavors total. So I was going to start out with the sort of what I'm looking for in a mandarin or tangerine flavor. Citrus and vaping is hard in general. Usually, what you're going to get from citrus flavors ends up being either completely like warm and waxy and weird, or it ends up being like pretty heavily zest forward. And I think both of those kind of flavors sort of have their own place. But what you don't end up getting is a lot of like juice or flesh from your citrus. Mandarin is kind of specifically bad at getting anything that really tastes juicy. You get a lot of top notes, you get a lot of wax, but nothing in between. Uh, it's a little bit better than orange though. I'm still kind of convinced that when people say they want an orange flavor in vaping, what they really want is a mandarin flavor. They don't want anything too like tart. They just want that kind of like sweet citrus, and I think that's where mandarin flavors come in. I was going to start out with Capella's Sweet Tangerine, which is a flavor that you see used a whole bunch, and one that I'm not really all that enamored of. To me, it kind of, well, I can go ahead and vape it and talk about it. Just tested it at 4% after a 5-day steep. Um, I'm not the biggest fan of this flavor. It tastes kind of like the orange note from like vitamins, like Flintstones vitamins, chewable vitamins. It's definitely sweet, which it has going for it, but it's kind of a sort of a flat, unsatisfying sweetness. It kind of feels like it's just the bad part of a sucralose sweetness. It tends to just feel really dead in mixes for me. It doesn't bring in a lot of the sort of vibrancy and acidity that you'd actually want with citrus flavor. On the bright side, it doesn't have really an overwhelming sort of peel note to it. There isn't too much zest, but it's just kind of unsatisfying, kind of chalky. It tastes a lot like Tang to me. You see this flavor used a whole bunch in like the mythical Pog profile, the pineapple orange guava, where they're trying to get like some sort of orange juice or tangerine juice out of it. And it just doesn't ever really click for me. I also find that it's maybe a little bit harsh for how dull this flavor is. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's definitely more of like a candy tangerine flavor. I'd kind of relegate it to using in sort of non-realistic sweeter candy profiles. I don't go through a ton of this stuff, and honestly, I've been more frustrated with it than anything else. But it has a lot of pull in the community. I think if you are going to use it, you generally want to use a relatively heavy hand with it. It's pretty useless down below 3%. I have it up at 4% here, but I've seen it taken up to like 6, 8% pretty successfully. Although at that level, I do get some pretty hellacious throat hit, but it's definitely not my favorite tangerine. So I also have kind of an oddball for this test. So medicine flower, rebottled as lotus flower for ECX. I kind of stumbled into a sale that they were running where I was picking up their 5 milliliter bottles for, oh, I think it was like $3 or $4. I picked up a whole bunch of the flavors and I've been kind of comparing it where it really feels applicable. The stuff's a pain in the ass to work with, basically. Everything's sub 1%, so you're making dilutions, which isn't that bad. And actually, it's like, okay, there's the value thing, except for the fact that you have to dick around with making an extra batch of bottles. Um, but the percentages on these are supposed to be like really finicky, and then everybody swears by needing at least a month worth of steep. on it. And honestly, there's a couple flavors where I feel like they do a better job than other available flavors. Mandarin isn't necessarily one of those for me. It's kind of, it's sweet, it's fairly realistic. There's a decent balance to it, but I've found that like trying to work recipes around it, all the percentages and all that other weird stuff, it doesn't do enough that other Mandarin flavors do to really justify A, the added expense, or B, the added pain in the ass in working with it. It's definitely not a bad flavor, and I could see digging it, especially if you're into going the more medicine flower route and having some lighter, subtle flavors. But as far as I can tell, you can't really crank these up to the point where they're like full, vibrant, saturated flavors. They go from tasting a little bit light, but realistic, and then they just cross right over into the being like straight garbage. Like there doesn't seem to be like a really nice, comfortable range in there. This sample I'm testing is at 0.5%, but I've taken it up to 1% before, and it was definitely wrong at 1%, and it is too light at 0.5%. I've tried it at 0.75%, and it still seemed too light to me. So if you are going to use this, my guess is it's closer to 1% than anything else, but it's one of those that I just don't see putting in the extra effort for, which may say more about me as a mixer than it does about the quality of the flavor, but there's certainly nothing wrong with it. So next I have Lavoris Tangerine, and this one I actually haven't worked a lot with. This is not my first test of it, but damn near my first test of it. And it's good, in general, but I feel like it's really top heavy. It isn't quite just like a straight tangerine zest note, but it feels a little chalky to me. It feels a little dry. It also has a pretty noticeable throat hit on it, which is an issue that I ran into with a couple of the Flavorah fruits, the more realistic ones. The thing it does well, I think it doesn't have a lot of wax to it, and it seems really top heavy. Which can be a good thing. I think if you just want some very realistic tangerine top notes, it has just a little bit of like earthy bitterness to it too, which will end up showing back up with one of the other flavors, but it makes it kind of hard to find a place for unless you want something like super realistic. It's Flavorah and it's fairly concentrated. 1% will probably do anything that you need it to, but I think maybe it's a little too realistic and not really all that fun. It doesn't really capture what I want from a Mandarin tangerine flavor. Yeah, it doesn't have a lot of juiciness. It seems like it's all kind of top notes, and there isn't really much of a base to it. This is one that I haven't done a full review on. The ones that I've done full reviews on are that there's full reviews available from the Reddit DIY flavor section. I'll go ahead and link to in the description, but I've got to play around with that one a little bit more. It isn't really clicking for me right off the bat, though. Okay, so next we have, along with Cap Sweet Tangerine, probably the most used mandarin or tangerine flavor. It's Flavourart's Mandarin. And there's a lot of support for this flavor, and you'll see this flavor in a lot of recipes. Um, and generally, it works. It's sweet, but I'm not the biggest fan of this flavor. I guess you're seeing like a trend here. It's really waxy to me, like distressingly like warm and waxy. And there's a spice note or like an earthy spice note that kind of reminds me of more of like a bergamot flavor. Feels like it's fairly close to that. On top of that kind of overly sweet, waxy, warm base. Um, I've seen it work. It works fairly well, but it works more as an accent. I don't think it's really a full, rich enough kind of flavor to put center stage on anything. I don't get a lot of zest off of it, which is cool if that's what you're looking for, but that sort of warmth and that waxiness in the body that it does have doesn't really translate over to like a juicy or fleshy flavor for me. And that earthy note has that slight spice to it, which is kind of off putting. It's a little harder to pick out in mixes, but generally, if there's FA Mandarin something, I tend to get like a little bit of like an errant spice, and it's kind of hard to mix around. I mean, I wouldn't kick it out of bed, but and it doesn't taste like chalky candy tang like Capella Sweet Tangerine, but there's some issues with it that I don't think are really addressed in most of the places that I see it. So next, Flavorwest Tangerine, which I've done a fairly recent like video segment on, and I also have recently put out like an actual Reddit review that I'll link. But I like Flavorwest Tangerine, which should be fairly obvious by now. So Flavorwest Tangerine reminds me more of tangerine zest. It's definitely a top-heavy flavor. It's one of their natural flavors, so they have this bizarre warning about like it being inconsistent. So maybe watch out for that. But yeah, it doesn't seem as candied to me as Capella's Sweet Tangerine, although it is maybe just a touch over sweet. It has a really good tangerine zest note without bringing any of that kind of earthy or like pith taste to it. I would use this primarily as like a citrus top note in something, like adding it in as an accent. I don't feel like really has the body by itself to kind of carry an entire like tangerine or mandarin vape, but I feel like it does a really good job bringing in those like natural top notes. And while it's a little bit sweet, I don't feel like it's oversweet to the point of going like straight candy or offensive. It definitely needs something underneath it to kind of fill it out, though. I wouldn't use it as a solo flavor, as like a primary flavor in a mix. So the curveball for all this is my actual favorite tangerine flavor or mandarin flavor isn't a mandarin or tangerine at all. It's Flavourart's Blood Orange, which is relatively new. Um, I really like this flavor. It does a lot of what I want from a mandarin without being called a mandarin. It's sweet. It has some actual body to it. I still wouldn't really go so far as to call it juicy, but it definitely has some actual volume. Unlike the Flavourart Mandarin, I don't get much wax. I get like maybe a little bit of that warm waxy flavor, but it's very subtle compared to the Flavourart Mandarin. It doesn't have that kind of like earthy, more mysterious flavor that usually shows up in a blood orange. It's a little sweeter than that, a little bit more simple than that, and the overall effect is a lot like the base for a tangerine flavor. So yeah, I dig this stuff. I think if it came down to it, sort of building what I think my ideal tangerine flavor was, knowing that tangerine's kind of a shorthand for a sweeter, less aggressive citrus flavor, I would probably start out with about 2.5%, 3% of the Flavourart Blood Orange, and then add another 2 or 3% of the Flavorwest Tangerine to bring kind of back in those top notes. So you get at least some kind of base there. You get a good helping of sweetness, and then the Flavorwest Tangerine would come back in and kind of layer in some of those realistic top notes and give you something that actually tastes fairly close to what you want a realistic take on a tangerine to taste like. So working with tangerine in general, just some of the tips. Ethyl maltol is going to be your best friend. All citrus flavors, tangerine flavors included, have a tendency to skew a little bit harsh. Ethyl maltol, otherwise known as TFA's cotton candy, um, doesn't really sweeten up the base tangerine note so much as it helps to kind of round off the corners of the flavor and kind of get rid of some of that higher, harsher note while leaving most of the underlying flavor intact. Works a lot better than like something like sucralose does for that. The other trick is there's a whole lot of flavors that have like maltol in them, or ethyl maltol in them. And so something like TPA's ripe strawberry or TFA's TPA, I guess they're the same fucking company. Their vanilla swirl can do a lot to kind of calm down the citrus while still giving you what you kind of want to get from it. Citrus pairings in general, citrus and bakeries, kind of hard. You don't see it a whole lot. If you were going to go for a citrus in a bakery, that's where I think something like the FA Mandarin would probably work, where you have something heavier to kind of soak up those earthy notes. Citrus and creams, a lot of what you end up seeing, like tangerine and mandarin flavors mixed with creams. A lot of them go for like a creamsicle kind of profile. Wayne Walker, aka Enyawreklaw, from DIY or Die fame, actually has a pretty good creamsicle recipe up that uses Flavourart's blood orange. He comes back in with the Flavourart mandarin. I'd probably go for the Flavorwest tangerine, but it's a really solid recipe and kind of a good application of a creamsicle in general. But anytime you add like citrus to creams, you're gonna have some sort of weird profile issues. Best case, it kind of end up tasting like an orange Julius, which would be fantastic, but it's hard to kind of let those brighter citrus flavors and like those richer cream flavors kind of play together. So you're better off using lighter creams in general. Unless you're specifically going for it, I have found that citrus and like buttery notes, like from Enyawreklaw custard or even Capella's vanilla custard, don't necessarily combine particularly well. They tend to kind of clash with each other. I like to stick with like lighter, fluffier creams with like less of a milk or dairy note. Again, the vanilla swirl comes in to that, but like vanilla shisha by Enyawreklaw mixes pretty well with citruses. Uh, but yeah, fruit mixes, kind of a no-brainer. For fruit mixes, if you want just the top notes, I'd probably go for the Flavorwest Tangerine. If you want more of a full tangerine flavor with a fruit mix, Flavourart's blood orange would work. They tend to work better as sort of an accent to sort of richer, syrupy flavors, kind of give you a little bit more contrast. Or you can take it more into like strawberries or something that's a little bit brighter. And they tend to kind of blend together there, which is actually kind of cool. It adds a little bit of like a vivid note to some of those fruit mixes. But yeah, tangerines, man. Those are my opinions, obviously. So your mileage may vary, but I hope this is helpful. I'll go ahead and link the reviews and any of the recipes that I've discussed in the actual description for the video. But thank you for watching. I'll catch you later.